Story 1. There is an entire six-figure career training doctors to use confidential medical software tools. Many people ask about this. Epic Systems employs many people and often has job openings. Story 2. Remember that Seinfeld episode where the local medical school hires actors to pretend to be patients exhibiting symptoms for medical students? That is a real job. It is called a standardized patient. Story 3. I drive for my state's organ recovery agency. When someone dies and their organs are harvested for transplant, they are flown by helicopter from one hospital to another. If the weather is too bad for flight, I get special permission to drive as fast as I safely can through the rain. I make about 1 or 2 trips a month, and they are more stressful than driving through Afghanistan. Story 4. I had a friend who worked at a zoo that had penguins. The zoo was below the flight path of a major airport. The penguins were fascinated by the planes. They would stare at them and lean backward until they fell over. When a penguin could not get back up, my friend had to pick it up and set it upright. Story 5. Compressed gas for welding or medical use. It is everywhere and an easy industry to enter. I was stuck in the service industry until coronavirus disease 2019 hit, and I was hired at a filling plant at $25 per hour. Linda, Roberts, and Airgas are the major companies, with smaller competitors as well. Decent career path for anyone who might feel stuck. Story 6. An adjunct professor has all the responsibilities and time commitments of a full-time professor but is paid very little and has no benefits or job security. They now make up about 75% of college educators, and most people do not realize these professors earn less than a target employee. Story 7. Line stander. There are people whose entire job is to wait in line for things on your behalf. Not quite as relevant in the digital age, but I imagine they still have a market. Story 8. Light-emitting diode technician, also known as a person who works for event companies and builds light-emitting diode video walls for concerts. It is like building a giant Lego wall. Story 9. I am a cancer registrar. I work for the largest hospital network in my country, entering data about every cancer patient and every patient with a benign or non-neoplastic condition seen in our institutions. I grade and stage each disease, enter demographic information, and record treatment and survivorship details. I work completely remotely and have never interacted with patients. I studied anatomy, pathophysiology, medical coding, law, hospital statistics, and epidemiology, and I had to pass the national certification exam to earn my designation. I am certified by my college, pay yearly dues, and maintain continuing professional education credits. The work is rewarding and fulfilling, especially as someone who lost parents and parents-in-law to cancer, but it can occasionally be very heavy. For example, a woman aged 35 years who was a new mother chose assisted suicide because of her incurable esophageal carcinoma. Most people had never heard of this job, including me before I became one. Story 10. Football teams have a sideline person often called the get-back person. Teams can be penalized if staff or players are too close to the field, so this person spends the entire game shooing coaches and players back. I have seen the get-back person hold a coach by the belt when the coach confronts the referees. Story 11. Never heard of it, but I have always wondered what the best boy job is that scrolls by in the movie credits. I do not care enough to look it up, so you do not have to tell me unless you feel compelled. Story 12. Specialized cleaners. Diogenes cleaners specialize in cleaning the homes of people with Diogenes syndrome. Postmortem cleaners clean after a deceased person is removed. Cleaners for explosive atmospheres perform industrial cleaning in environments at risk of explosion. Nuclear cleaners perform cleaning in nuclear power plants. Story 13. A medical illustrator creates visual materials used by personal injury attorneys to explain injuries to juries, by hospitals and medical staff for training and procedural documentation, and by pharmaceutical companies to show the efficacy of medications. One example is the visual concept of coronavirus disease 2019, a sphere, with crown-like spikes representing the virus and its surface proteins. This visual concept was developed by medical illustrators at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and was arguably one of the most recognizable images worldwide for a time. My eldest is a medical illustrator, which is how I became aware of this career. Story 14. Apparently, nobody has ever heard of a compositor. I was the person who did green screens and added explosions and muzzle flashes to movies and television shows. Every time I tell someone that is what I used to do, their face goes blank and they give a 1,000-yard stare as they try to figure out what the title means. Story 15. I am a crude oil scheduler. No one has heard of my job, so I always have to explain it. In the same industry, a pipeline controller can start with no experience, be fully trained on the job, and after a few years you are in the six figures. Story 16. When I was in Cebu, they had a crew of 100 who washed the lagoon floor every 2 nights at my resort. They drained the lagoon, scrubbed the algae from the concrete, then refilled it. Took about 6 hours. Story 17. In the Dominican Republic, crews jump into cesspools and scoop them out with only a shovel. Story 18. Not unheard of, but probably not well known or often considered. I am an environmental engineering technologist and I monitor environmental conditions at landfills. Story 19. Policy analysts are the people who work in government and ensure past and future policy and procedure are in accordance with the relevant laws and regulations. A lot of people have very little idea what goes on in government. I think our government should be run by bureaucrats with guidance from the public. Every single time a politician influences policy because of ideological bias, they mess things up for everyone and make government policy harder to understand and enforce. Why are government regulations so convoluted? Because of capitalism. Businesses are constantly trying to get around clear, fair written policy to gain an advantage over their competitors. That forces us to fill the holes, sometimes in inelegant ways, so business can happen on an even playing field. The amount of effort required to keep business fair, though it never fully is astounding. Government is there for business first, people second. Anyway, business breaks our regulations and then complains to the press that regulation is too complicated and that we need to streamline the process, which usually means fewer rules and less public safety. I worked in liquor regulation, which cost the province more each year in policing and medical care than it brought in through liquor taxes. Story 20. When a peregrine falcon became trapped in our warehouse, I discovered there are people who are falcon recovery specialists. I feel like I missed my calling. Story 21. My brother-in-law traveled the world to taste dishes and develop new flavors and recipes for foods in the United States. Story 22. Not my job, but I heard that someone used to dive in dolphin enclosures to clean the glass walls. Story 23. I heard of an interesting role. An educational consultant helps adolescents decide what to do after secondary school, apply to programs, navigate the transition with coursework and studying, obtain needed accommodations, and liaise with schools when further advocacy is required. Story 24. The city has a public administrator who handles the property and assets of a person who died alone. The Times published a full article on this about 10 years ago. Story 25. I work as a reservations coordinator. When you book a hotel, I review your reservation to make sure there are no errors, the sourcing code is correct, and the small notes and requests you add to your stay are communicated to the property. Basically, the job is email, laugh out loud. Story 26. A reliability coordinator is an essential role in the bulk electric power system responsible for maintaining the reliability and security of the grid by monitoring system conditions, performing contingency analyses, and coordinating with other entities to address potential issues. The position is staffed around the clock year-round. Only 1,500 people in the country have the North American Electric Reliability Corporation certification required to perform the job. This role is unlikely to be outsourced because the national electric grid is not expected to be controlled from outside the country. Story 27. A friend who works in film and theater has 2 types of gigs I have never heard of. The first is as a mock patient for medical students. Sometimes he disrobes for simulated prostate or testicular examinations. The second is as a mock suspect for police department training. He acts as a suspect or assailant and is neutralized and detained according to the scenario. He found both gigs after struggling in film for many years. Story 28. The fields of architecture and construction have a niche role called building information modeling. In addition to traditional two-dimensional blueprints, most modern construction projects are modeled digitally in 3 dimensions. This modeling is used for tasks such as coordinating system routing and quantifying materials. Story 29. I research mathematics. I don't know if this is a great answer, but everyone I tell is shocked and asks whether we already know all of mathematics. Story 30. My uncle is a professional sleeper, paid to test mattresses and bedding for big box stores, logging everything from sag to snore proofing. It sounds dreamy until you realize it means 8-hour naps under fluorescent lights while half asleep and taking notes. He can earn 6 figures if he is in a union, but the real perk is free pillows and other merchandise. That makes retail therapy look basic. Do you know any dream job twists that turned nightmarish? Story 31. My dad was an elevator mechanic. He always said the job had its ups and downs. Story 32. I used to catch shoplifters for a living. I was paid well toward the end of my career, although I was in a managerial role. Story 33. The person who sits on your face and farts for $20 per minute. Story 34. Career ladder guy will enjoy researching the entries here. Story 35. Medical science liaison. In summary, they work for pharmaceutical companies and sell their products to hospitals and research groups. Story 36. I learned earlier today that sewage engineering is a distinct field with sewage engineer as a recognized job title. Story 37. Private concierge. I know someone who works for wealthy clients and organizes arrangements for them, mainly when they are on holiday. This can be as simple as a restaurant reservation, sometimes booking the entire venue, or as extensive as coordinating a much larger, lavish event. Story 38. In chicken processing plants, there is a position called gullet ripper. Story 39. Penetration specialist at Microsoft Security. Maybe people have heard of it and thought the title was worth repeating. Story 40. International Business Machines Information Management System Specialists and Systems Network Architecture Experts are a niche group and essential to our world. Story 41. This is impossible to answer. Anyone who answers is wrong because they have only heard of the job. Story 42. Some cow and horse insemination specialists collect semen, freeze it on dry ice, and sell it to farmers. I have not seen one in a while. My brother did this briefly in the 1980s. For example, every horse that competed in the Kentucky Derby this year could trace its lineage back to the famous Secretariat. He sired thousands of horses, but he rarely left his stall after retirement and almost never had mares visit him. His semen was collected and frozen, and he continued siring foals long after his death. I believe some of his semen is still frozen for future study. Story 43. An acquaintance of mine used to sell sperm in Russia. Story 44. There are wacky jobs in some Asian countries that most people, even those who live there, have probably never heard of. Story 45. Perfusionist. The person who operates extracorporeal membrane oxygenation during surgeries. Typically requires a Bachelor of Science degree and completion of a specialized program, although graduate programs also exist. Dosimetrist. The person who calculates radiation treatments. Typically requires a Bachelor of Science degree and completion of a specialized program. Cancer or tumor registrar. Collects and inputs data into databases regarding cancer cases for research, requires some college and completion of a registrar program, and is a good transition job for people with a college degree. Story 46. Excellent question. The last time I looked, more than 20,000 occupations were listed in the online dictionary of occupational titles. The average person can probably name 50 at most. However, if you mention an obscure job, someone will have heard of it. If I were going to train for an occupation today, I'd probably train to be a recreational vehicle repair technician or an orthopedic prosthetist. Story 47. Chicken sexing is well-paid work if you can make the grade. Story 48. Ball rotators are people who rotate balls in and out during games such as volleyball, wiping sweat from a ball and handing a dry one to the server. Story 49. Cemetery and funeral death care investigator. I know someone who works at a cemetery, and a state investigator audits cemeteries every few years to ensure compliance with the law. Story 50. A golf ball diver is a real job in which people dive using self-contained underwater breathing apparatus in ponds on golf courses to retrieve thousands of lost golf balls. Story 51. A hod carrier carries bricks or mortar to the bricklayers. Story 52. I remember seeing people in Japan working as foot scratchers. I am not joking. Story 53. A pickle stem cutter is a worker in pickle factories who measures the stems left after the pickling process and cuts them to the proper length. Story 54. My company conducted clinical research on cadavers to improve anatomical knowledge. It took months to start because of negotiations over the acquisition and donation of the bodies, involving many people. Story 55. I am an email marketing deliverability expert. Deliverability is like the dark arts. Story 56. I am in field sales now, but my first job with the company was on site at one of our largest customers, serving as our company's point of contact. We supplied safety and other materials to keep their plant running. I filled bins and vending machines, sourced items not on our website, and helped with invoices. It was a catch-all job that I did not know existed before my husband started working for the company a few years before I joined. Story 57. My former boyfriend married a Japanese undertaker who prepared corpses. He always told others that she was an artist. Story 58. Watcher. I was offshore on a drill ship. There was a Spanish girl on board who spent all day on the bridge with a pair of binoculars, looking for migrating whales and such. If she spotted any, we had to stop. Apparently, it is a thing on drill ships and well paid too. Better than working your guts off on the rig floor any day of the week. Story 59. I earn six figures helping financial advisors and firms use the software they have for financial planning. Story 60. An organ harvester I knew was on call to rush to scenes of recent deaths and immediately begin harvesting. These were special orders. If they needed a leg, he retrieved a leg. If they needed a liver, he retrieved a liver. Time was of the essence, so he focused on the highest priority item, placed it on ice, and handed it to the transport team. Story 61. I spent the better part of the 2010s as a butt pusher at a nursing home. You know, these older people can't thrust like they used to, so they need a brawny young man like me, hamstrings tighter than guitar strings, to work their hips like they remember. I'd see a horny couple shuffling down the hall and think, oh geez, no way they're going to have sex again. But you have to give it up for these old-timers. They're constantly intimate. So I would put on long gloves, help them to the private room, place the woman in the accessible sex swing, gently remove their clothes and sanitary undergarments, and take hold of the man's leathery hips. He would handle his erection himself. I wasn't going to coax that out of him. If he wasn't hard enough, I would leave the room and tell him to call me when he was serious, when he could actually perform. Usually that was enough for them to get an erection. When he was ready and she was lubricated as medically appropriate, I was there to make sure the thrusting was firm but not too hard. I wanted to make sure these two could return to their apartments afterward. Took, 10-15 minutes maybe? With the adjustability of the swing, the variety made the time go by quickly. After he ejaculated and her genital area was messy, they would go into a kind of post-orgasm paralysis, and it was part of my job to make sure they didn't hurt themselves during that. Then I would get her out of the swing, help them into their clothes, and go back to wandering the halls, waiting for another tap on the shoulder. Terrible job. I hated it, but I still did my best. I was proud of how much lovemaking I facilitated and how sensually I could maneuver those hips. Not a job many people have these days because of certain governmental restrictions that I don't want to get into in a public chat. But we butt pushers do keep in touch. Story 62. This is impossible to answer because as soon as someone names a job, at least one person has heard of it. Story 63. A royal excrement inspector was a real job in the past. The position involved inspecting the royal family's excrement. Story 64. I provide global assistance for high net worth clients who want to build multi-generational wealth funds with Bitcoin. I am confident I am the only person doing exactly that. Story 65. Diversity, equity, and inclusion protester. I get paid millions from Soros to protest against Republicans. Well, according to Republicans, this year I've made nothing, but according to people Trump knows, good people, I am wealthy beyond belief and poised to receive substantial checks for my time in Portland. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.